Thanks. This is my third time speaking at this conference, and it's a great pleasure to be here. Before I begin, I'd like to give some acknowledgments. I'd like to thank people who have contributed to the content of this talk. Anderson Todd, Daniel Craig, Junsun Kim, Talia Francidis, Philip Rajewicz, Elizabeth Long, and Hannah Chow. And I'd like to also point out that I've given 3 talks on altered states of consciousness, 2 of them at this previous instances of this conference. Those are all on YouTube, and this will be following up on those talks in significant ways. So what do I want to do today? I want to present a problem, which I call the onto-normativity of higher states of consciousness. And that probably doesn't mean anything to you right now, because it's philosophical jargon, and I'll explain what that means in a few moments. I want to explain what is needed to solve this problem, why this problem is central, at least philosophically and scientifically, because it, I think, is central to why psychedelic experiences are therapeutic and why they're sapiential, why they can afford the cultivation of wisdom and flourishing. I'm going to talk about that we're going to need a descriptively adequate account and a prescriptively adequate account. I'm then going to try to meet the descriptive demand and do it on 3 levels: the cognitive level, the information processing level, and the neuroscientific level. And then I'm also going to attempt to meet the prescriptive demand. Do these states actually provide rational justification for the claims made by those who undergo them? Because if they don't, then however therapeutic it is, we face a special epistemic problem with these altered states of consciousness. If they're ultimately all delusional, that's problematic. So I want to remind you of a couple things that Mark said in his excellent talk, that these experiences are ultimately about connection, and that one of the most important mediators is spirituality, and then that spirituality is very generic in nature, because I want to address that. So what's this problem? People experiences altered states of consciousness, and there's a subset, and some of these occur with psychedelic experiences, that have a particular profile that really interests me. Unlike most altered states of consciousness, people view the experience they have in that state as being more real. Right? They experience the world as somehow more real. They experience themselves as somehow more real, and if you'll forgive the jargon, there's sort of a mutual moreness. There's a resonance between a more real self and a more real world. And this sense of more realness is normative. It puts a demand on people. They often feel they need to transform their lives. And they feel not only the demand of the state, but they feel that the state guides them in transforming their life and in going through transformative experience, something I talked about in my talk last year. People change their self, their worldview, their relationships, and their environment, which of course is part of the therapeutic power of these states. This is what I mean by onto-normativity. Onto having to do with being, reality, and normativity, that it puts a demand on people and guides them in changing themselves. And I want to call this subspecies of altered states that have onto-normativity higher states of consciousness, since higher connotes this normative excellence. Now, these experiences are quantitatively and qualitatively very interesting. Mark set that up, I think, wonderfully, right? Taylor, in his recent book, has 150 sort of case studies of people reporting these, and you read them all. Newberg, in his recent book from 2016, Newberg and Walburn, had over 1,500 people in their survey reporting on these experiences. Larger surveys of the population in general average around 30 to 40% of people are having these states of, higher states of consciousness. Qualitatively, why do I think these states are important? I think you could make a very good case. I've made it elsewhere, so I'll only make it briefly here, that at the core of the axial age religions and wisdom traditions, you find claims about higher states of consciousness that have onto-normativity. You have the henosis, theosis claims within Neoplatonist spirituality in the West. You have moksha within Vedanta. You have kensho and satori. You have nirvana. All of these are claims that I have this state of consciousness that reveals what is more real and guides me on how I should change my life. Let me teach it to you. So these states are both quantitatively and qualitatively interesting. Now, why is the onto-normativity of higher states of consciousness so problematic? Why don't we just accept what these people say? Well, of course we have, and world religions have been founded, and wars have been fought, etc. Right? But I think it's problematic from a scientific and philosophical view, because first of all, it seems to be the basis for why people are changing their lives, going through deep transformative experiences on the basis of these states. But notice how these higher states of consciousness contrast with most of our other altered states of consciousnesses, right? Here's a standard one we all do every day. You dream. It's an altered state of consciousness, right? And typically when we wake up, we say, well, that wasn't real life. Now philosophers will go, oh, how do you know you're not dreaming? Right? But for most of us, how do we know we're not dreaming? How do we know that this is, what's the difference for us between reality and the dream world? Why do we reject most of our altered states of consciousness as being illusory or delusional in nature? Why? Well, the answer is broadly, and most of the philosophical arguments converge on this, right? Something like intelligibility coherence. We have this sort of coherent picture that makes the most sense of the most of our experiences. And the dream experiences don't cohere with that, and so we reject them. And when we see something, right, when we're drunk, and it's right, and we reject that because it doesn't cohere with all of this. Now, the weird thing about higher states of consciousness is exactly the reverse of this. The reverse of this, right? This state isn't rejected, it's promoted. In fact, it's promoted to such a degree that it does this. Think how weird this is. Think of the contrast with dreaming. You have this state, and you don't come back and say, hey, that doesn't cohere with all of this. That was pretty fucked up. Oh, sorry. Right? That was pretty messed up. Instead, what you do is the following. You go into this and say, hey, that doesn't cohere with all of this. All of this is messed up. That's weird. That is really weird. And it's precisely because it does that that people are willing to so dramatically change themselves and their lives. Think about it, this higher state of consciousness is a temporary experience, right? It does not cohere with the rest of your experience. That's how light can challenge all of your experience. And the higher state of consciousness, right, often doesn't have any intelligible content to it. Not only does it not cohere, it doesn't have any intelligibility at all. People say, I can't tell you about it, but it was great. It's beyond words. It's beyond reason. And so, you know what you should say? Think about it. What you normally do is, if somebody comes up to you and says, I have this altered state of consciousness, it doesn't cohere with the rest of my life, I can't put it into words, I can't explain it to you, and I can't give you a rational account of it, you go, ugh. Ugh. We do the opposite with these states. That's the problem. Why do we? Now, why do we promote them rather than reject them? In order to answer, or try, I'm not going to completely answer it. I'm starting this. This is going to be a big part of my future work while I'm on sabbatical. I'm on sabbatical, by the way. Yay for me. Okay. And so, what we need an account that is descriptively adequate. What do I mean by that? We need an account of the underlying processes and mechanisms that can explain the phenomenological profile, that can explain, right, the structure of the experience that people are having when they're having a higher state of consciousness. And explain not only that phenomenological profile, but why does it motivate people to go through transformative experience? Why does it do that? We also need an account that's going to be prescriptively adequate. We need this is going to be more philosophical. The first account is going to be more psychological. The second account is going to be more philosophical. Do these states actually provide any rational justification for the claims that people make, the changes that they undergo? Because if not, that's very problematic for a lot of reasons. Now, what we want is we want the mechanisms we come up with in the descriptive account to mesh with our rational justification account. We want the psychological and the philosophical accounts to ultimately be integrated so that the descriptive and the prescriptive come together. Now, the descriptive adequacy, coming up with a descriptively adequate account, is going to be best served in a cognitive scientific way. What do I mean by that? We want to talk about mechanisms at the cognitive level. What are the cognitive mechanisms that are at work in these higher states of consciousness? We want to talk about it at the information processing level. What are the machine learning mechanisms that are already existing in current cutting-edge AI that can give us insight into what's going on? And thirdly, the neurological level. And Mark pointed to some of that already. So what's happening in these states? I've read so many first-person accounts of this now. It's sort of blurry in my mind, over and over, like hundreds and hundreds of these accounts. And so the gist of it, there's a very common pattern that emerges. Now, not every account has all of these features, but most accounts have most of these features. So people experience their world with like a tremendous sense of clarity. It's often bright in some sense, right? It's very comprehensive, but it's not blurred or homogeneous blob. It's comprehensive, but they also have fine, detailed awareness. One way that Taylor puts it is the world is both intricate and interesting. Right? They have a sense of that world fundamentally making sense in a way it never did before. Beautiful. I have a whole talk on the beauty aspect of these experiences. I think it's a really great talk. I can't give it, so sorry, don't have time. I'm going to give it in a video series I'm preparing. There's a tremendous sense of oneness. The world is filled with significance. It's very alive. Right? On the side of the self, people report deep peace. Inner conflict is gone. And it's not so much that all their problems have been solved as their problems have been dissolved. Joy, a sense of deep connected to what is right and good. There's this weird thing, sort of it's almost Platonic, sort of a remembering or realizing their true self, which can often be explained as the no self or the non-self or the Buddha nature or Atman, right? The metaphysics vary wildly, but there's some sense of getting to the truth of in here, right? There's tremendous energy and vitality. There's a sense of deep insight and understanding. And the connection between the self and the world. What's that connection? As Mark said, there's this deep connectedness, often to the point of identity. People will say that I felt deeply connected, almost identical with this world. There's this sense of deep participation, but it's ineffable. Another important thing to note about this, right, is these states are often preceded by disruptive strategies. Disruptive strategies that are meant to disrupt our sensory motor, psychosomatic homeostasis. Right? And these can range from fasting, deprivation, the use of psychedelics for very short, powerful disruptive strategies, or they can be more long-term incremental training disruptive strategies like mindfulness practices, Tai Chi Chuan, things like that. Okay? Yaden, in a recent study, a much more controlled study from 2017 involving 701 people, found that 69% of people who are having sort of religious, spiritual, mystical experiences report them as having this onto-normativity, and found good, significant evidence for improvement. Mark already showed you this in family life, health, sense of purpose, spirituality, reduced sense of fear. But Yaden's work also points out something else, because he did a linguistic analysis of these reports, is you get a significant decentering effect. Right? So what does that mean is that people stop describing things from a first-person perspective. They describe things much more allocentrically. They become more ontocentric rather than egocentric in their orientation and processing. Okay, so what do I think is going on? Well, first of all, and this is something that I think none of you will find surprising given some of my other talks, I think that higher states of consciousness have a lot of the features of insight experiences. You know, the aha moment you have, you've been looking at a problem, you've been framing it the wrong way, you're, and we put a light bulb over people's heads. And why do we put a light bulb over people's heads? Because there's this flash. There's a flash. There's an actual brightening. There's supersalience in the experience. People feel very connected to this. They're suddenly making sense of what didn't make sense before. And we know this ability to induce making sense, coherence, is predictive of enhanced meaning in life. Samantha Heinzelman's recent experimental work has shown that if you increase people's sense of making sense of their experience and then ask them how meaningful their lives are, they rate their lives as significantly more meaningful. It's like the act of making sense, generalizes in some very powerful way. We know from the work of Tobolensky and Reber from 2010, they make a very good case for that. When you're having an insight moment, you're getting a spike in fluency. You're getting a sudden increase in fluency. What do we know from the psychological work on fluency? Fluency is basically the ease at which you're doing your processing, how readily you're making sense of information. And the more fluency you have in your processing, the more confident you are in it, the more real you find it. And that's irrespective of the content of what you're processing. It's a purely processing measure. So recently, this year, I published with Adrian Herrera-Bennett and Leo Ferraro, paper connecting insight and the flow state. Some of you know what the flow state is, right? When you've been in the zone, when you're in the zone and you're really focused. And Csikszentmihalyi has just made this the mainstay of positive psychology. What do we know from the flow state? You have a radical sense of at-one-ment. Think about how similar that is to mystical experiences, right? You have this paradoxical state. You know you're exerting a lot of effort, but it feels effortless because it's self-organizing. It's running on its own, right? You have reduced self-consciousness. Not consciousness. You don't fall unconscious. That's ridiculous. But that sense of self-consciousness, you're egocentric, narratively preservative. How am I doing? How's my hair? Do these people like me? How am I doing? Does she like me? Oh, no. All of that falls away. Right? Supersalience. The world glows. It's bright. Tremendous sense of it making sense. And it's very intrinsically rewarding. That's why people do stuff that makes no sense. My favorite example of a thing that people do that induces flow states is rock climbing. My friend Peter does rock climbing. Because rock climbing should be a torture in Greek mythology. Okay, this is what you do. You see that rock, sir? Yes, you're going to climb up it. You're going to hurt yourself. It's going to be demanding, physically draining. You might fall down and hurt yourself and die. And when you get to the top, come back down. Why do people do it? They do it because, and we know this because we studied it, they do it because it induces the flow state. Why? And this is part of what I'm going to argue. What's going on in the flow state? When you're rock climbing, right, you frame the rock, your connectedness to it in one way, and if you lock into a misframing, you get physically stuck. And you have to restructure your cognition, your perception, your attention to move on. And again, and again, and again. Do you see what that is? It's like one moment of insight, aha, priming another moment, aha, aha. And it's like an extended aha. That's why it has all of these features that it has. There's something else going on in the flow experience. So you have a capacity for implicit learning. You have the capacity to pick up on complex patterns without conscious awareness of it. This is very well established. And Hogarth argues in 2001, this is your basis of your intuitive judgments. You've picked up implicit patterns. Like, I know how close I should stand. Like this, I shouldn't lecture from here. Right? That's just wrong, right? You know how close to stand to somebody, and it's so contextually variable. Like you have all of these implicit patterns, and you have intuitions about how to do them, but you don't know where the intuition comes from. That's part of being an intuition, precisely because it was produced by implicit learning. Now, the problem with your implicit learning is it just picks up on any pattern it can in the environment. What people forget is there's a name for intuition that picks up on bad correlational patterns. It's called prejudice and bias. When you're a racist, you have strong intuitions about the inferiority of other people because you've picked up implicitly on a false pattern. The thing you have to do with your implicit learning is you have to put it into a situation where it will not attach to false correlational patterns, but will zero in on causal patterns. The way you do that is to basically put people into the flow state. They're interacting, tightly coupled, tightly connected, tight feedback, error matters. So what's happening in the flow state is you're both priming your insight abilities and improving your implicit learning and your generation of intuition. Notice how we're already getting towards a lot of the features of a mystical experience in the flow state. So this has led to what I call a continuity hypothesis. I have it, and Newberg and Wahlberg have it. The idea that insight experiences are like on a continuum with flow experiences, that are on a continuum with mystical experiences, that are on a continuum with higher states of consciousness, which are often called awakening experiences. These are mystical experiences that produce this profoundly transformative effect in people. Now, what's going on cognitively? Well, I think there's something going on flow, but I don't think it's so much sensory motor flow. It's a kind of cognitive flow, but in what sense? Well, I want to make use of a notion that Dreyfus is talking about now, and Dreyfus and Taylor, but it ultimately goes back to Merleau-Ponty. This is the notion of optimal grip. That when think about it perceptually, first of all. When I'm moving around, when I want to see somebody, I'll move till I get to a place that has a certain set of features for me. It gives me sort of the most information on them without losing, detail. I try to get the best balance between the most comprehensive information and without losing the details, right? Now think again about what's going on in these experiences. They're comprehensive, but holding on to the detail. What's a cognitive example of optimal grip? So Eleanor Roche talks about the fact that we really prefer what she called basic level categories. We like to talk about things like dogs and cats rather than mammals or cocker spaniels. Why do we like to talk at that level? Because that's the level that gets the best balance between having all the things in the categories similar to each other and keeping all the differences between the various categories. We're getting this balance, again, between gathering as much as we can while keeping all the relevant differences. So we're constantly pursuing optimal grip. Now the thing is, I've talked about categories and objects, but the thing is, I'm doing it here in this whole big scene. And this scene is shifting, so my optimal grip is dynamic. So what I'm proposing to you is the following, right? That what's happening in these higher states of consciousness is you're getting a flow state on your optimal grip. You're getting, You're getting into a flow state, but what skill are you using? Because usually when you're in a flow state, you have to be exercising a skill, like rock climbing, tennis, martial arts, music. But you know what skill you've worked really hard at all your life, and you depend on every single second? It's your skill of optimal gripping. And what you're flowing with in these higher states of consciousness is your skill of optimal grip. Now, this hypothesis would help to explain the disruptive strategies, because if something like insight, flowing insight in your optimal grip is at the core of them, that would help explain the disruptive strategies, because disruptive strategies are central to insight. I talked about this last year in my talk at UTism. Because in insight, you have to break up an inappropriate way of framing something. Like, this damn thing that haunts me. Okay, join all 9 dots with 4 straight lines. The next line has to start from the previous line. People think this is really easy. 1, 2, 3, 4. Oh, I missed the center. 1, 2, 3. Oh. And the spontaneous solution rate is not statistically different from 0. This is actually a very hard problem, right? 1, 2, 3, 4. What is so hard about that? Because you have to break the frame of the square. Disruptive strategies are needed. So people use distraction. Not too much, not too little. They play with their attention. They drive it down to the features. They blow it up to the gestalt. They try to do things to shift in hemispheric production of behavior. Why are they doing this? Because they're trying to de-automatize their cognition. They're trying to take processes that are habitual and are constraining how we're framing things, and break up that habit, de-automatize it, reduce that biasing, so that other potential ways of framing become available to us. Now, what if you had that kind of flowing insight into your optimal grip framing on the world? You would be gripping the world better than you have before, an enhanced sense of connectedness. Now, the thing about these disruptive strategies is they have two sides to them. What you're basically doing is increasing variation in your processing. And as you increase variation, right, what you actually do is reveal what's more invariant. If I increase variance, I become much more aware of what's staying invariant. And there's a positive and negative form of invariance. The positive form is, here's the invariant stuff that keeps predicting my success in the world. And so I'm going to generalize that more. But there's also negative invariance. Like, wow, I didn't solve that problem, I didn't solve that problem, I didn't solve that problem, I didn't solve that problem. And one of the ways you improve insight is what's called the notice invariance heuristic. You try and find what you're not changing across all of your failures. Because chances are, that's what you need to change. And very often, the only way you'll become aware of that is by increasing a lot of variation in your processing. Now, if you were to open that up, really expand it in this flowing optimal grip state, in which you have more implicit learning, giving you more patterns, more insight, more flexibility about it, here's this possibility. Right? I wouldn't notice just this error. I'd notice systematic error. I would notice errors that all mutually predict each other. That was Piaget's great insight about development. See, what made Piaget famous was he realized that the mistakes kids were making were systematic. They weren't ad hoc. They were predictive. They were systematically related to each other. When a kid is making conservation errors, they're not just making it on this problem, they're making it across all kinds of problems, types of problems. If you open up the notice invariance heuristic, you're not going to have just an insight into this problem or this problem. You're going to have an insight potentially into systems of problems that are holding you back, like addiction. You could find a nexus for development. McGee and Barber talk about this kind of finding of systematic error and going through development as the core of wisdom. They call it seeing through illusion. It's the core feature of most accounts of wisdom, this ability to pick up on systematic error and see through it. There's one aspect of this disruptive strategy that's particularly important. This is the decentering. We already know from Igor Grossman's recent work that just getting people to decenter improves their ability to solve problems. Take somebody with a strong interpersonal problem, they will describe it to you first person. Get them to decenter. Get them to re-describe the same problem from the third person perspective, and they will see solutions they couldn't see before. It's a big part of why your therapy works, by the way. Don't tell them that too much. Okay? Now, why? What else might be going on in this decentering? So there's some recent work by, recently reviewed and integrated together by Sue and Humphreys from 2015 about the self as a machine, a cognitive. It's basically, they call it the glue of your processing. What the self machinery seems to be doing is integrating different processes, getting different brain areas to talk to each other. Now, they use integration. I don't think that's quite right. It's actually complexification. Because in complexification, a process is simultaneously differentiating and integrating. Like your biological self, your body differentiated into different organs while remaining integrated together. And when things complexify, they get new functions. We have a lot of work from Michael Anderson on the massive redeployment hypothesis that one of the things the brain can do is it can exact its own function. Exaptation is when you take a machine that was designed for one thing and you find how to use it for something else. My tongue evolved for poison detection and moving things around in my mouth to eat, but I'm using it now to speak. It has been exapted for language. And your brain is constantly exapting its own circuitry. What I'm proposing to you is the brain, when we decenter, can exact all that self-machinery, and instead of processing the self so much, it can help process the optimal grip on the world. And this would line up with proposals made by Novak in 1996 and Claxton in 2000 that what seems to be going on in these states is we're somehow taking the energy. I don't like it when people use that word in psychology, because people in California get too happy about that. But, right, when you take the energy that's been trapped in the self and you start to use it to get a more ontocentric and deeper understanding of the world. Okay, so how does this line up with information processing? So, recent article by Woodward and al. 2014, and Dan's talked about this too, that when you have a neural network and you're trying to get it to learn, you know what you should do? And what you have all these disruptive strategies. Dropout, right? Randomization. Why? In fact, listen to this quote. Randomization into the neural network, this is a quote, is an essential aspect of the self-optimization process. That's how you get these things to self-improve in their ability to learn about the world. Why? Why being disruptive? Why does that help? Because it does two things. It prevents overfitting to the data. Right? This is when, is that what you did in high school when you were given a scattered plot? No. You were taught to do this. Why? Sorry. Why? Were your teachers like fascists or something? I'm not touching any of the dots here. Isn't this bad empiricism? Isn't John Locke turning over in his grave? This allows me to generalize. If I overfit to the data, right, I'm guilty of, right, finding the information in my sample, of projecting it inappropriately. Right? But I can't ignore the data. Here's my line. Right? You have to get this sweet spot. You have to disrupt, you have to introduce disruptive variation, and then you turn it back on and it recompresses. This is called data compression. It does recompresses. And that's how you get the best, how you get between, right, overgeneralizing and overfitting. It's how you get this sweet spot. That reminds me of an important point, and Mark made this clear. And I've argued it in all of my talks about setting psychedelics within a ritual context, within a sapiential tradition. If you'll allow me a musical analogy, if you try to jam without skills, you don't get jazz, you get junk. You might get a little moments of, ooh, that was cool, but the rest of it is garbage. Right? Because you're trying to get this sweet spot. It's not easy to get. That's why artificial intelligence is turning out to be hard. Okay, now what's going on in the brain? Well, Newberg, because he's wealthy, because he's famous, has access to amazing equipment, and he's put people into all kinds of brain scans as they're having these experiences. And he's found a reliable sequence of brain activity. Initially, you get really massive increased activity in the frontal areas and the parietal areas. And some of you know that one of the most powerful theories of intelligence, general intelligence, is the ability of the frontal areas and the parietal areas to talk to each other. It's called the Pea Fit Theory. And what general intelligence is basically doing, I've argued in many places, I can't do it right now, but it's helping you to zero in on the relevant information and then break out and like you do here, and find what you need to find relevant in order to solve your problems. So first of all, this massively increases, and then it massively drops. It goes like this. Whoosh, whoosh. Hugely disruptive. The greater that shift, the more powerful the experience, the more capable it is of inducing insight and transformation. Throughout all of this, you have enhanced activity of the thalamus. And some of you know the thalamus is responsible for deep complexification, for integrating while maintaining differentiation in information. That's why there's a lot of associations between it and consciousness. And some of you know I argued 2 talks ago about the deep connections between consciousness and the ability to alter in a fluid manner what you find salient. I think what's going on here at the brain level lines up with a lot of the work that Kelso and Tognogli talk about in the brain. They have a theory of metastability. See, there's two sort of functions your brain can do. It can integrate information together. It can also differentiate. It can segregate. But there's a third state your brain can get into, metastability. And in metastability, the brain is simultaneously integrating and differentiating. It's getting that sweet spot. And it's really associated with your ability to do very complex tasks in an important way. And what's really intriguing is work by Lauderdale this year, showing clear evidence that what psilocybin does is increase metastability in the brain. Okay, so that's the descriptive account. What about the prescriptive account? Well, notice what I've done here. I've tried to show you that there's two sides to the processing that's going on here. You have de-automatization, you have decentering, right? You have fluency in processing. All of these are individually reducing the biasing in your cognition, and because they're independently convergent, that independent convergence also reduces biasing. That's why you like it when information converges between your senses. Because if I can touch something, see it, right, and hear it, I think of it as most real, because the chances that all of those are converging due to bias is very low. So when you get this kind of, each one of these is reducing bias, and then you get independent convergence, you're getting massive bias reduction. Now, this doesn't mean that what's happening is true, but it produces what's called, what the philosopher Nicholas Rescher called trustworthiness. Your processing is highly trustworthy. You've got good reason to believe that, right, the bias has been reduced. It's converging on a state. It's this high fluency optimal grip, right? High fluency optimal grip, which is a powerful state for you because it is predictive of you being able to do a bunch of things. Flow, get into the flow state, to find systematic error, to complexify your cognition and produce new emergent functions, optimizing your processing, exaptation of the self-machinery. So notice what you've got here. You've got all of this trustworthiness onto this state that's itself powerful for you, that is then predictive of an enhancement in power. Now, when you get that kind of convergence between trustworthiness and power, that produces a state that has a property called high plausibility. It's highly plausible. In fact, if it's very highly plausible, you will find it a profound state. We tend to find theories profound in which we have independent lines of evidence that lead to a construct that then predicts all kinds of things we weren't able to predict before. Now, plausibility really matters. Plausibility really matters. Think about this. Meaningful plausibility really matters. It matters all through science, for example. Science is inference to the best explanation. It's not, right? It's not Lockean induction. I could give you a 4-hour lecture on why that's the case. I'm not going to. Just trust me on that. It's not, okay? This is what we do. We have a phenomena, and I'll show you how you do it, and we generate several explanations for it, right? We put them into competition, and we find the one that wins the competition. Inference to the best explanation. And we say that's the best theory. That's how Darwin works. Right? He beats out Paley and other people. This is what you're doing even in an experiment. Because what do you do in an experiment? Do you just test the independent variable against the dependent variable? What do you also do? Come on. What do you do? Controls. What are controls? Alternative explanations. And you have to rule them out. Now, you know logically how many alternative explanations there are? Infinite. So, I'm going to rule out it was caused by elves. I'm going to rule out it was caused by time travel. Look, isn't my experiment great? Your experiment, your theory is only as good as the plausibility of the alternatives. Plausibility matters for your rationality deeply. All of these optimization processes are prior to any of your inferential reasoning. Until you have framed things right, until you have optimal grip on the world, Your judgments about what's relevant and important are skewed, and your reasoning is going to be skewed. The framing is prior in a very important way. That's why a lot of these processes are domain general, like flow and insight and fluency. They are happening regardless of the specific content. Now, notice what I've not said. This rationality of processing that I'm talking about, its plausibility and its priority because of optimization, I'm not claiming that that's the same thing as the justification of any inferential argumentation. Talking about the indispensability of plausibility, talking about the optimality of your processing, talking about the priority of all of this is not any kind of claim to have founding certainty or establishing any kind of metaphysical foundation. Look, Mark said this too, and he's right. People have these experiences and they go, oh, I knew there was a God. Oh, I knew there wasn't a God. The content, it's all over the place. If somebody takes DMT and tells you that the hyperspace elves told them that they should die so that they could go to Venus, don't do it. Okay, I'm not arguing for that at all. What we should do instead, and we have a historical example for this, I think is the following. I think we should have an independently, notice that word, established worldview. Established by our best science, philosophy, and history. We should have these higher states of consciousness with their onto-normativity. They don't tell us about the objective state of the world. That's what I've argued. They tell us not about objectivity, and they're not just subjective. A word I've used about this is they're transjective. They tell us about how we're fitting the world. And this matters. Think, this idea of fit, it's central to Darwinian theory. How a creature fits an environment. It's not a property of the creature and the environment, but of a real relationship between them. A real relation. The optimal grip. People can use this as a touchstone on their transjectivity. How well connected are they to the world? How sapientially are they developing their capacity for wisdom? Because you want the wise pursuit of knowledge, not just what we've developed in our culture to great personal danger and cultural danger, the unfettered pursuit of knowledge. What we want is a reflective equilibrium between them, where we use this to challenge any metaphysical claims coming out of this, but we use this to challenge ourselves. Are we well connected to the world? Are we cultivating wisdom as we practice our science? There are historical examples of this. That's why I think Mark emphasized the fact that you need to set these psychedelic experiences, especially their mystical aspect, within some kind of framework. In the West, Neoplatonism was an example of this. You had rational argumentation for a worldview independently established that was in this kind of reflective relationship with the mystical experiences they had. So, by the way, that's not an argument that Neoplatonism is true, although you should read more Plotinus. But what's an example of? It's an example of that we can do that. We can have good, right, dialogue, reflective equilibrium between the cultivation of wisdom and the cultivation of knowledge. We can put the onto-normativity of higher states of consciousness, I think, into its proper place, not say too little about it, explain why it can bring about freedom from being entrapped and why it can afford flourishing of wisdom and well-being, but not saying too much, not saying that it allows us to create an entire personal worldview metaphysics. Thank you very much.